Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar event titled Oscar Cahén. My name is Yves Trépanier. I'm the founder and co-owner of, with Kevin Baer, of TrépanierBaer Gallery, which is located in Calgary. How did we get here? 7 years ago, Michael Cahén, son of Oscar Cahén, called me. He was looking for a gallery to represent the Cahén estate. Michael had been for many years working to refocus the gaze and on his father's career and his legacy. He'd spent the previous almost 20 years repatriating the work, restoring and documenting the work. He'd established the Cahén archive. The monograph, Oscar Cahén, was about to be published. And he felt now was the time to go public. I was surprised to receive the phone call. I was delighted and honored, and after 2 or 3 minutes of discussion with my business partner, Kevin, we happily agreed. Little did Michael know that while growing up in Toronto, I lived in Toronto from 1970 till 1978 and spent a lot of time at the AGO with a friend of mine who wanted to be an artist. Oscar was my favorite of the Painters 11 people, or artists. And that was a little kind of art dealer's secret of mine that very few people knew and knew at the time. So the work began. We planned a series of exhibitions, consecutive exhibitions at the art fair in Toronto, beginning in about 2015. In 2017, the book was published along with the exhibition at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery, a major survey that was curated by Jeffrey Spalding. In 2019, we organized an exhibition in TrépanierBaer, which was very successful. We featured some 26 works from various periods of Oscar's career. And then I had an idea that we should do something in Toronto, and the painting The Warrior had been rattling around in my head for some years, and I'd seen it at the Beaverbrook. I'd seen it many times at the National Gallery, where it was featured for many years and was shown there in an exhibition titled, I think, Crisis of Abstraction. I thought that we should represent this major work in Toronto.
Let me just say, Yves, that it's right behind Pat Feheley's shoulder there.
Right.
Yes. We're going to look at it in more depth in a minute, but carry on.
So I thought, well, how do we do that? We need a venue. And Pat Feheley and I, who had known each other for many years, also called me and said that the center gallery space in her gallery was available. And would I like to work with her and use it to mount exhibitions as a kind of extension of our program in Calgary? And I said, well, that sounds like a great idea, but why don't you then mount some exhibitions and organize some exhibitions in Calgary? And so we began to kind of develop this notion of a kind of collaboration and exchange, as bilateral kind of exchange between the galleries. And the first exhibition to come to fore was the Oscar Cahén show with a feature on representing The Warrior. And on that note, I will turn it over to Pat Feheley, who will tell you an interesting and surprising story about all of this. Pat?
Not to make too long a story of it, but Yves actually said this to me as we were walking into Papier Art Fair 3 years ago. He said, you know, how do you feel about having an Oscar Cahén exhibition? I literally came to a dead stop walking and said, you do know the history, don't you? And Yves said, no. And of course, the history is that my father opened a gallery called the Park Gallery in the mid 1950s. It was eventually expropriated in 1960 for the subway. And he showed Painters 11, among many other shows, a solo for Jack Bush, et cetera. But in 1957, he had a show where Oscar had died, but he had done this extraordinary painting, which is the painting you see right here. which was the largest painting ever did and a magnificent one. And as a tribute to him, the painting was brought in, it was put in pride of place in the Park Gallery. And there were photographs of the group sitting around it as an homage Oscar. And I knew all of this. I was too young to really remember the Park Gallery, but because we had an amazing treasure trove of photographs of that particular exhibition and of the warrior. And so it resonated with me for many reasons. I would cooperate or collaborate with Eve anytime, but on this show, I just had this amazing personal reaction to the fact that I had grown up knowing about this. Mm-hmm. And like Eve, if it's not a terrible thing to say, I mean, Oscar Cahén to me was always my favorite of the Painters 11 group. Mm. So we set the show up, and I have to tell you that yesterday, when the crate came in and they unveiled this extraordinary painting, I had the most amazing visceral reaction. It is so fabulous. It is monumental. It is fabulous. But I also had a feeling, and I wasn't around for the Park Gallery, but I just had this feeling that it had come home again. And that is very, very strong for me. So that brings us to the fact that I currently in my gallery in Toronto have an extraordinary exhibition of Oscar Cahén paintings. And I am so thrilled to be able to share these with everyone. And I know you just saw the picture of the homage to Oscar, and then this is a close-up of the warrior, and it has pride of place here in my gallery.
It looks absolutely spectacular, Pat. And I'm Sarah Milroy. I'm going to be moderating tonight, Chief Curator at McMichael. And I have, two of my favorite people you've already met tonight, which is Yves Trépanier and Pat Feheley, both extraordinary art dealers in Canada who've made such an enormous contribution, and we love you both. But also some very dear friends of very long-standing. Sara Angel, give us a little wave there, is the PhD, is the founder and executive director of the Art Canada Institute, as we all know, and which is a research organization based at the University of Toronto, dedicated to the education and promotion of Canadian art and its history. And it's just grown explosively over the few years that it's been around, and is now such an important part of the ecosystem of the art world. It's hard to imagine it without the ACI. Angel is the publisher of the book Oscar Cahén, Life and Work by Jaleen Grove, which was published by ACI. She is an adjunct professor at York University and Western University as well. And she has an extensive career in arts journalism and publishing, writes on contemporary visual culture for the Globe and Mail, Art News, Maclean's, and Walrus to make the art world accessible to a broader audience, which is certainly a mission close to my own heart. She also manages to have 3 children in hockey, soccer, and I don't know what other sports that her brood does. So it's not quite clear the space-time physics of this woman's life, but I deeply admire her. So Sarah, thanks for being here. Jaleen Grove, who is a new person in my life with this panel. I've not met Jaleen before, but Jaleen served as scholar in residence at the Cahén Archives 2013 to 16. So she is the deep researcher right now on Oscar Cahén, and she's the author of Oscar Cahén, Life and Work, published by ACI. She's a specialist, particularly in the history and practice of illustration, which, as she's going to explain, is particularly important in the story of Oscar Cahén, who was extremely accomplished in that area. And she's currently assistant professor in illustration at the Rhode Island School of Design. So Jaleen, it's great to have you with us. And lastly, Robert Enright, I was going to call you an old friend, but I think I have to say a friend of long standing now. Now that we're both getting a little gray, forever young, Robert is the senior contributing editor and film critic for Border Crossings magazine and the research professor in art theory and criticism in the School of Fine Art and Music at the University of Guelph, where I know, Robert, you've had a massive impact on many, many careers of rising Canadian artists over the many years you've been there. How long have you been at Guelph now?
I think going in the 16th or 17th year since 2005.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, well,
Oh, it
the
does.
students are sensational. So it's a great privilege to teach there. It's a
Well,
wonderful.
they're very lucky to have you too. It must be a fantastic atmosphere. In 2005, he was made a member of the Order of Canada, and he now lives in Winnipeg, and he has for
a long time, for a long-standing time here in Winnipeg.
Yes. So I was going to say, we're going to go through a series of questions. And what I'd like to do is that most people have been designated to respond in principle to one of these questions that we have. But if someone has a thought and they want to just sort of leap in, please do, because it's not really an academic panel. It's much more of a dinner party. That's how I'm hoping to think about it. So, yield each other the floor when that's necessary, but spontaneous combustion is encouraged. So let's start just for a little spontaneous combustion talking about the warrior, because, and maybe I'll start off because I was talking with Eve earlier on today. We just touched base quickly. And I was saying, I find myself looking at this painting and thinking it really like, who are the roommates in Canadian art for this painting? Because it has this element, I feel, of, of course, there's things we're going to talk about like representation and abstraction and so on, that's going on in the painting, but it's really about this grotesque vision. And I found myself, Robert, I'm looking at you, I'm not quite sure why, but, thinking about Philip Guston, thinking about how Guston moves back into representation when he needs to kind of confront the grotesquerie of America and Vietnam and so on. But I'm just curious to know what you or anyone else here is making of this extraordinary picture. And it is huge. It is an epic, all engulfing monster of a picture.
Well, it's hard to, in a lot of ways, it's hard to read it. And one of the things that continues to intrigue me about Oscar Cahén's work is that I don't always know where I am. And I don't just mean relative to notions of abstraction and representation or figuration, but rather I sometimes I just don't know. I mean, I'm trying to figure out those little tiny illustrational arms,
Yes, these little guys.
Figure. I mean, that is just such an odd touch. And it seems to me, and Jaleen would know this better, that seems to be a kind of revisitation to a certain sense of illustration. And there's a way in which, for me, Oscar Cahén never lost either a notion of illustration and the notion of line and how line functions any more than he actually lost the notion of the figure operating somewhere. So often his work keeps reminding me in a kind of totemic way, even though ostensibly on the surface, it's not about the figure, it ends up being about that. And the warrior is an even more complicated notion of that, because the recomplication of the painting surface, to use a phrase from Patrick Heron, the British painter, is just, absolutely embodied in this painting. It's such a complicated notion of a painting.
Yeah, and it has this kind of Trumpian bloat about it too. And it's both. I mean, I think what's so interesting about it, and Adam Welsh touches on that in his, essay in this honking great tome on Oscar Cahén that Pat was, nice enough to lend to me. But, the sense that it's both overpowering and huge, but also weirdly vulnerable and kind of fleshy and soft and formless at the same time. I mean, there really isn't any, there are kings and jesters and so on, and we'll see some of them tonight, but there's nothing quite like this anywhere else in his work, I don't think, except the studies for it. Was I remembering rightly that it was based on a suit of armor that maybe Jaleen knows, that a suit of armor that he had seen?
Yeah, it's thought that he was referencing a suit of armor that was at the Royal Ontario Museum. And yes, there's a series of drawings that precede this painting where he's kind of working out some of the formal elements. He changes it for the canvas. I would totally agree with Robert Enright that there's always a loyalty to the graphic line in his work, no matter how abstract it gets. It's very much rooted in black line or a sense of that, of drawing. But there are attachments here, I'll say, with his long-standing exploration of the figure, both through abstraction and through more academic figuration. And I think he is maybe trying to reconcile those two impulses here. I see this as being very much about kind of trying to embody trauma, which I see as sort of a leitmotif that runs through all of its work, trauma.
Absolutely.
And there's something to be said too of that section of the painting on the left-hand side, that sort of abstract place.
Yeah, this
It's
area.
almost pushing against the shield, and that tension that you've been talking about is really beautifully expressed. That tension between representation and abstraction is happening there. But for me, I see that as the optimistic part of this painting.
Yes.
That's where the light is. That's where
Glowing.
you're looking outside of this horrible, horrific kind of scene of this, this kind of vulnerable soldier who's literally in a way defeated, and yet somehow, it's not completely dark. And I think that's the wonder of the painting for me, and I find that with a lot of Oscar's work, the way he uses color, and often very dark compositions as these little sort of lighthouses of light that signal that it's not all that bad.
Or it has almost like a ribald kind of quality to it, or
Yeah.
Well, look at Sara Angel. How about you take us back from this monumental achievement back to his.
For sure. I wanted to add one comment about the warrior before beginning.
Yes,
and it's this. I'm going to really take down the academic and the art language and tell you about a Jewish phrase. And Oscar Cahén was of Jewish descent.
Yes.
And a very wise rabbi once said to me that one of the things about being a Jew is that you have to take the oi with the joy. And in The Warrior and in so much of Oscar's work,
yes,
there is a constant tension between a real hardship, but a real vitality and love of life. And that is, I see this as the ultimate embodiment of that sentiment.
That's fantastic.
And there was a lot of pain in his life, but there were also there was a lot of color, a lot of wonderful joy. And so we see it here. And then the next slide. So this is Oscar, a self-portrait that he does at age 22. So I'd mentioned a moment ago that he's of Jewish heritage, and he is born in Europe, and he's born in Copenhagen, and his dad is an art history professor turned journalist, who takes the family around Europe to many different locations. And one of the things that allows is for a young Oscar to have a lot of exposure to European styles. We can see in here there's elements of Cubism, elements of Cézanne, and I think one of the things that's so formative about and so key about his style is that he takes in everything that he's seeing, but he makes it his own. And so if you go on, you'll see this next slide. So one of the things so this is a completely different style, right? At this point, Oscar he's gone to art school in Dresden, and he's learned how to become an illustrator, and he's learned how to work we're going to hear more about this from Jaleen, who's really the expert, but within illustration, within graphic design. One of the things about Oscar's father was that he was a Nazi resistor. And so this is an illustration that was done for a publication, and it is essentially mocking the German, the Nazi power that is in place at the time, right? And you can see
the Aryan idea with the Norse paganism.
Exactly. Yeah. And then going on, you can see. So this is a work that he will make later. Oscar ends up with his family. They're in Germany, but because of the anti-Semitism there, they move to Prague, where things are not that much better. And just before there is the German invasion into Czechoslovakia, the family escapes. And so you see that Oscar is working in a very, very established, sophisticated graphic design style. But the next slide that I want to show you.
Can I just say something here at this?
Please.
Can you just, everybody who's online, just pay attention to those blue notations and that color. and how they're positioned in this work. And just keep that in the back of the mind as we look at other works as the webinar goes on.
Great.
Yeah, Eve, thank you for pointing that out, because it ties into the next thing that I wanted to say about this work, Zoo, that he's done significantly earlier. It's 1931 when he creates this work. And in fact, he's a student in Dresden at the time. And if you look at this work that is of a zoo animal, a monkey, so sparse in its amount of detail, it's so completely abstracted. And so again,
I have to say, it's very haunting and
very, very haunting,
creepy.
An incredible use of just 3 letters with design at the same time, for huge impact and effect. And the works that we've just seen, they're so different in their styles, but as well, think about very much Oscar Cahén is in a milieu in Europe where poster design is very revered. It's very, very respected. Nobody's saying that because, keep in mind, the artist Toulouse-Lautrec was working within the graphic design sensibility, working at the same time as a painter. People, you have to be one or the other. So at the moment that he leaves, that he has to leave Prague because of the impending Nazi invasion, he is really working in a very, very sophisticated, interesting way.
So I guess what we should do now is ask Jaleen if she'll take us deeper into the illustration work and the movement, eventually out of Europe. Jaleen, you start your book with this torn photograph, and you say
this image, well, I'm interested in the life of the object itself. This photograph, as you can see, it's been torn here, and I've handled the original. It's more battered up than as it appears here. Families and people with peaceful lives, their photographs stay in albums. They don't get torn and battered. So it bears the traces. This is taken in 1932. Oscar is about 16 years old here. He looked older than his actual age. He actually lied by a year to get into art school, a year younger than he was supposed to.
Oh boy.
And the year after, 1933, the family got a tip that they were going to be arrested. Things were going to get bad. So they prepared themselves for a little afternoon outing, like a picnic perhaps, and slipped out of town on the train and just kept going and went to Czechoslovakia. And that photograph would have been with them because they had to leave everything behind because they didn't want to look like they're actually moving out of the country.
Yeah.
Right. So who knows when that was torn? Was it that moment as they hurried and packed and got out of there? I don't know.
Yeah.
This image here is after they arrive in Czechoslovakia, made their way to Prague. And there they had to eke out a survival. They were not a wealthy family by any means. His father, Fritz Max, had trained in university as a philosopher and a political scientist, but made his living as a journalist. And in the First World War, right, had been in the employ of Count Brockdorff-Rantzau, and who was very active in the Treaty of Versailles. And in that role, it seems that he got involved in espionage, and this is at the tail end of the First World War. This is from MI5 and MI6 documents that we know this. By the time we get up to the Nazi years, Fritz Max was very much against the National Socialist Party and had received a beating in 1930 for trying to speak at one of their rallies and tell them how misguided they were, I assume. So he knew they were bad news. And that's why he had to leave, because he was politically active and he was trying to form a coalition of people against Hitler to try and bring down the Nazi regime. And so they're on the run, seriously. And when they're in Prague, he is busy with his network, which was actually fairly broad because he'd moved around Europe so much through the 20s as a journalist, building networks and ties. So they were traveling a lot, even though they were in Czechoslovakia. We have documentation of them going to Geneva, going to Rome, all over the place except Germany.
Yeah.
Well, sort of Germany. There's even an instance where they join a film crew briefly because it was one of the ways to make some money, but it also took them into the mountains on the border with Germany. And Fritz Max claims that they were sending Oscar even and parcels and so on, getting smuggled over the border that way. So the family's involved in espionage, and we know that also from the Prague secret police files. And Oscar was helping out with this. Gets into a little bit of trouble about that. He's named when Fritz Max is also named in conjunction with a gun smuggling deal, for instance. Oscar is caught with illegal radio equipment in his car and is questioned. This later creates complications for them to get out of Czechoslovakia. Fritz Max leaves first, writes that book that we just saw, Men Against Hitler, in the US, where he is then stuck for the next 20 years. Oscar and his mother were having trouble getting out because they didn't have papers anymore. Their passports had expired. And it took a while to get the correct documentation, which the secret police kind of made happen, despite him getting caught with radio equipment. So that allows them finally to exit March 3rd, 1939, about 3 weeks before the Nazis invade Prague.
God.
Yeah.
So Jaleen, can you just tell us about this slide for a moment? So I think
Sure. So these are cut out of a magazine where they were published. They're by Oscar, but he has written in pencil. You can just see it very faintly in the bottom, based on Schick. And he's referring to Arthur Schick, who was a very famous artist and illustrator in the United States, a Jewish American who was very well known for caricatures of the leaders of the Axis of Evil that ran on the cover of Collier's magazine. And so Oscar has borrowed the style here to do his own renditions of the same men. We don't know where they're published. We only have this record at present in his scrapbook. But it's very typical of Oscar's facility with picking up a style of other people. He's really good at that.
Yeah, and also, what is the circuit? Who are the mentor? Who are the kind of people that he's looking at in terms of the commercial illustration world, and looking at illustrators that are involved in this kind of dissidence and social commentary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Oscar, I think, got really wary of being politically active, first of all, because he himself was under such danger and kind of dragged into it by his father's political activity. That was kind of scary. And when he was in Canada, it was conditional that he not be political. In fact, keeping his head down was how he kind of got approved to be, put from one place to another and finally released. So he was not anxious to have a reputation as a political artist. That's not to say his work doesn't embody that, but I think that's why it comes out in abstraction.
Interesting paradox. Yeah, we just looked at Warrior. So Sara Angel, Cahén escaped Nazi Europe for England. And of course, he ended up in a Canadian internment camp where, kind of improbably, he found a new start in life. And, who finds opportunity in an internment camp? But, somehow it seems Oscar Cahén managed to. I noticed, when people are talking, they're calling Oscar instead, the way they call Emily Carr Emily. It's interesting. There's certain kinds of figures in Canadian art. I mean, no one calls Bourgeois Paul Emile, It's sort of like there's a sort of affection there.
Well, he signed Oscar, so it's a bit of it.
But it's just something to notice. Okay, so Sarah, tell us about his coming across to Canada and how he manages to make something out of this situation he found himself in.
So Sarah, it's quite shocking how he comes to Canada in the most surprising of ways, and it's really essentially as a prisoner of war, as an enemy alien is the best way to put it. Like many Jewish German-speaking men, Oscar Cahén escaped to England, assuming that there would be a new start, a new life there. Another well-known Canadian in the art world who had the same trajectory and the same path was the art dealer Max Stern, who reestablished himself in Montreal. And what happened to these Jewish men who ended up in England is that they were German speaking. And so once the war began, they were suspected that because they were German speaking, that they could in fact be enemy aliens. And so they were rounded up, and then they were sent to the colonies, either Canada or Australia. Sometimes they were given a choice. And so Oscar Cahén ends up in a prison camp that is in Quebec, just outside of Sherbrooke. And it's a piece of history that not that many Canadians know, that these men who were extremely talented, extremely well-respected in their countries ended up essentially being detained.
Again,
Oscar's in the camp for 2 years.
Mhm.
And he creates this illustration. There is, you can see there, life is not great, right? But if you move on to the next slide, what you can see is that there was a movement for these men who it was recognized that they were not criminals, so to speak. So often they were asked, what sort of profession do you have? What type of skill do you have? What can you do? I mentioned the art dealer Max Stern. He was literally teaching art in the detainee camp. Oscar began working at what he knew how to do best, which was doing illustration. And from there, he ended up being hired by the Standard magazine, and he was able to then have that step out of the enemy alien camp into a professional life. And Jaleen, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I could. So yeah, this was first arranged by a group that was there to kind of help refugees transition. And they brought his work to the Standard, and they liked it. So they agreed to keep employing him, which then made him eligible for sponsorship outside to get out of the camp. And he was late getting out of that camp. Most people had gotten out already. And so that was Colin Gravener, a man named Colin Gravener in Montreal, very interesting fellow who did a lot of PR and all sorts of interesting stuff. And so Oscar worked there for a while, and that connection with him was actually made by a lady named Beatrice Fisher, who sadly just passed away not long ago. And she had come to the camp to do a story. She was working as a journalist for a little periodical called Magazine Digest. And she kind of wiled her way to get an interview with Prisoner, and Oscar also wiled his way to get to be the one to meet her. He apparently had to bribe some other guys out of the lineup. And they kind of had love at first sight, really took a shine to each other and kept up correspondence. And that encouraged her to find a way to get him out. And that's why she hooked up Colin Gravener to sponsor him out. And their friendship.
He just goes on from there. He comes out and he just goes on from strength to strength.
Yeah.
Does he go straight to Toronto, or where is he on his way from the Maritimes?
So
brother.
Do you want me to answer, or should Sarah?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay, sure.
To his commercial career.
Yeah, no, he starts out in Montreal because he's working for Colin Gravener. That doesn't last too long, just maybe a couple of months, a few months. And then he transfers over to Rapid Grip in Batten, which was the same art and engraving firm that had previously employed the Group of Seven quite a few years before, their Montreal office. And there he works on various advertising and poster campaigns, including for the National Film Board. And then he's in Montreal for about 2 years. And then he gets an offer from Magazine Digest, the same group that had been employing Beatrice Fisher back in Toronto. And they ask him to come and be the art director for their magazine, which he does. And he does that for just under 2 years, doing covers. And it's kind of an important magazine that I've been doing more recent research on. We can maybe talk about that another time. But from there, he then can pitch Maclean's directly and get eventually a lot of Maclean's covers, and also another funky magazine called New Liberty.
Yes.
where he does some of his most innovative illustration work. Yeah.
So he's making this very, obviously, consumer friendly, delightful, engaging, upbeat, eye-catching, colorful work that he's doing in a kind of commercial illustration sector. But then he's also, taking on some extremely hard-hitting editorial work as well. And this is maybe one of the most famous. Can you tell us a bit about this assignment?
Yeah, so this is a magazine insert. So it would run on the weekends and it would carry fiction quite often, or sometimes special stories. And in this case, Hiroshima had just been published by the New Yorker magazine. That was its first edition where it first came out, and was an immediate sensation because it was incredibly visceral, intense, boots on the ground point of view into the experience of being in a nuclear bomb explosion and what happens afterwards, what it does to people's bodies, to the land, everything. So Oscar was, when it was reprinted for the Standard, and that was within a year of its first publication. It's a very early reprint. Oscar then did his research, as you can see on this kind of thing, and he illustrates that amazing cover and then many spot illustrations on the inside. So in this slide, you're seeing what we assume is a preparatory sketch for the series, and then 2 of the drawings that were actually published with the article on the interior.
Extraordinary.
Yeah.
So Cahén was.
Can I just say something at
Yes,
this point?
of course.
If you have the opportunity, you can download the Hershey story and read it. It's an amazing expose of post-Hiroshima trauma and the horrific situation those people found themselves in. And there's nothing I've read better to really express what that was like.
Yeah.
So I would encourage people, if
Yeah.
you can, to do so. It's an amazing story.
Yeah, we were talking about that earlier. Even it just sounds like a must read for sure.
It is. It's a must read.
It was on my grade 11 English class reading list, if you can believe it.
Oh, really? Wow.
Good for them. So somehow in the midst of this extraordinary commercial illustration career, he's also making paintings. And he starts to show with a group of abstract painters called the Painters 11. Sara Angel, can you take us into that aspect of his life? How did that start? Who were the Painters 11 and what role did he play in the group's creation?
Okay, I'm going to do this very, very quickly because we have a lot of other material to cover, and this could be a big topic. But I want to say that we're looking at is a publicity shot for what would become the Painters 11, and by this point, so it's 1953. Oscar has been in Canada since 1940. And he establishes a tremendous amount of success working within illustration, as Jaleen took us through. But at the same time, he remember Eve had mentioned earlier on the blue in that wonderful illustration of the nun in the sports car. If you think about the zoo illustration, a lot of abstraction is there, far earlier on in his career. And by 1949, he is working with his own abstract language, and he is working with color, and he's developing an abstracted style of his own. At the same time, in the world, and particularly in the US, a movement has started called the Abstract Expressionist movement. I think Jackson Pollock, Rothko, de Kooning, etc. And one of the things is that Canada is quite conservative, and it's not really adopting an abstract style. Remember, this is a country that loves the group of 7. And there are some individuals, though, Harold Town being one of them, Tom Hodgson being one of them, etc., who are advocates of abstract style. And so what happens is that there is an exhibition at the Simpsons department store of modern furniture. And a suggestion is made, why not hang some abstract modern paintings around to give a contextualization?
I mean, I bet the taste for modern furniture was quite in advance of the taste for modern painting in Toronto. And let's remember that there had been the Refus Global in Quebec. Like Quebec was away to the races, but Toronto was really doing the rocks and trees in the sky still.
That's right.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Oscar Cahén is encouraged to submit the work Candy Tree.
Mm-hmm.
The
So incredible. Mm-hmm.
Remarkable color. But what's really remarkable is the next slide. And I have to let Jaleen talk about this, because this is something that I learned about through Jaleen, who had found this incredible letter, document that Harold Town, one of the Painters 11 members, wrote, documenting the origin story. And I know it was an incredible moment for Jaleen when she came across it. Jaleen, I'm going to hand this over to you to tell us a bit about this letter.
Right. Hi. So the town archives are kind of under lock and key. You have to get special permission to look at them. And I think that's why nobody really picked up on this before, because not many people have actually dug through those in detail. There's a lot in those archives. And so, yeah, just buried right in there, I find this amazing account. And it gave a different narrative than what we've heard before in Canadian art history about the origins of Painters 11. And what's significant about it is Town is writing this quite close to the time that it happened. And I think a lot of rewriting got done over the years, because everyone kind of wanted to take a bit of credit for it. So I think it's kind of significant for that.
Wonderful to have this.
Can you read it, Jaleen?
Let's see here. I'm working on a kind of small screen.
Painters 11 had its real genesis one afternoon in 1953, when in discussion, Cahén, Yarwood, and myself decided that.
Right.
Breaks the bed, and then the bottom panel saying Cahén brought up the matter of an abstract show. So Cahén brought up the matter of an abstract show. The rest jumped at it with an overwhelming alacrity. A meeting was arranged, etc.
And then there was famously a meeting at Alexandra Luke's home.
This kind of shows who was pushing the button here to get this thing to start.
It is really significant. And something else that's really interesting is that there's always these remarks made that what the Painters 11 were doing was an emulation of what was going on south of the border. But one of the comments that Jack Bush made, one of the famous members of the Painters 11, was that in fact, Oscar Cahén was looking to Europe. And it was that sensibility that it was a bringing of the abstraction sensibility from Europe to Canada. And that is something that is entirely unique. And I think what that Jaleen's find that Oscar plays such a key role, that really he is, I think, the individual who gives the rest of the Painters 11 the confidence to say, we can go ahead and do this. Right.
Exactly.
Sarah, if I may, I just want to say that the oral history that came down to me through my father and various other people who were involved, it was continually that it was Oscar Cahén who led the charge, the one who actually started it and was the de facto leader of it happening.
Yeah, and as Harold Town clearly documented.
And what's so fascinating to me here, and again, Eve and I were talking about this earlier today, but I'm just looking again at Candy Tree. What's so fascinating to me is that when people think about Canadian art and the real accomplishment and abstraction, they think always about Bourdois and Riopelle. They think always about Quebec. And I kind of had this feeling, and I phoned Eve today and I said, this is how I've absorbed Canadian art history as a Western person coming into Central Canada, is that like the main event, like the serious abstract painters in Canada were the Quebecers, and the Painters 11 were always like, have not really been seen as having, given the same respect. They come after, Refus Global is in the 40s, and they're coming together, in the 50s. And they've kind of been, I think they've been dissed a little bit in that regard. And I don't know if other people, Robert, if you feel that is a view, but I think there's certain reasons for that. I think that maybe because they were so extravagantly laddish as artists, that now it's like they're seen as maybe not in these male careers, or maybe not ones that need to be front and foremost in scholarship. Although, you know, the Painters 11 had 2 women in them. They had Oscar, who was of Jewish descent. They had Katsuo Nakamura. So actually, it's really a fascinating group that kind of needs to be, I think, taken out and looked at again, but also pulled apart. These are very distinct careers. And I think sometimes in Canadian art, we look at, you know, the group of 7, for example, to take an example close to our work at the McMichael, and they think of them as one monolith, but each one is a totally different trajectory. But, you know, anyway, I just wanted to sort of raise that with everyone.
I think
I mean, one other thing that is worth sharing with the audience is that Cahén's life was tragically cut short.
Yes.
And so
where would he got to? Yeah.
Exactly. So in terms of the origin story, in terms of the group cohering, it was a very, very brief period.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Robert, you were going to say something.
Well, no, I was just going to make a joke. In Canada, we do paintings by numbers because there's also the Regina Five, who were instrumental in bringing modernism to the prairies as well. So I mean, I think we count our way through our lexicon of painters. You know, it's looking at the adoration, which is up right now. I did what Sarah said about the oi and the joy. This is such a strange painting in a lot of ways, and it's an example, I think, of in his work where you can see that there's still sort of residual cubism somewhere in there. There's that one figure, the woman walking away, looks like she's an effigy on the right-hand side with the lantern, maybe from the Easter Island, crossed with a face from Max Weber. But then you've got, you know, remember, this is an adoration painting, and Oscar Cahén enters the great tradition that every medieval and Renaissance painter did a version of the adoration, because it's the Epiphany, January the 6th, when the Magi come guided to Bethlehem by the star that we see in the painting. So all 3 of the kings are there. He does some neat things with it, though. The Christ child is probably the most, even though central in the painting, is in a lot of ways the most insignificant thing in the painting. The Mary, the mother, is more interesting, and so is the remarkable menorah in the lower left-hand side of it. So he kind of drops in this conventionally and traditionally Christian image. He also adds some sort of Judaic quality to it as well. It is interesting that Cy Strom, in the essay in the wonderful monograph, points out that Oscar didn't actually do many images dealing with Judaic culture. He did a terrific number of paintings of Christian, everything from the crucifixion to the adoration here. And it strikes me as a kind of anomalous thing, but I love the way he makes it his own entirely. It also has a terrific kind of compression to it. I mean, all the animals are there. There's the green donkey, there's the blue horse, there's the birds, there's a cow behind. I mean, all the components are there for a classic adoration, and yet it really is, as has already been remarked, I mean, he has a way of making things his own, even though he's operating inside structures of painting, compositional notions, and even styles of painting that come from somewhere else that he picks up on. He is a fabulous magpie of an artist. He flies off, brings back the best, not always the prettiest, but the best things, brings them back to his own painted little nest, and figures out how he's going to build the painting out of that. And I admire that in his work terrifically. You see it in the next slide too, by the way.
The other thing that happens in this painting is that arm, which is not dissimilar to the arm that's in the Warrior.
In the Warrior.
That whole right side is quite ambiguous, quite abstract, but that form repeats itself in various drawings and other paintings, and it really we see it very clearly. Those 2 arms are very similarly expressed in the Warrior.
And they give the sense of extremity.
Yeah.
You know, those elongated forms.
And there's it's really.
Here's an example too of the clearly a kind of residual cubism operating here, because this mask, I read that figure in the center as a figure, not merely as a series of planes that are either fractured or rendered as well. So it's quite clear where he's looking. He looks everywhere. He's absolutely omnivorous, so that you're not surprised to see that he's looking at Peter Lanyon and the St. Ives painters. You're not surprised that he's looking at Graham Sutherland and that kind of strange version of surrealism that Sutherland brings up. And you're not surprised that he's looking at American painters. I mean, he makes a comment in one of the articles I read to a journalist who was being critical of the work he was doing. And what Oscar Cahén says is, well, you don't get it at all. What it is, it's about the push and pull of emotions. paintings. Well, you use the phrase push and pull, and you know that he's referring to Hans Hofmann, who he also knows. So that, I mean, he just looked everywhere all the time. And you see it in this final painting too, I was going to talk about briefly.
But I do think that, you know, one of the things here is that, you know, we talk a lot about how Cahén, and we will more, how Cahén is impacted by American abex, but there's less attention paid to what the impact of British painting was too. In this period of Canadian art. And he's not looking at France particularly. You know, he may be looking more at Britain than at America at times.
For sure. And a lot of those works, certainly Graham Sutherland's work, would have been shown at the AGO.
This is it.
The AGO was collecting a lot of the, and
Exactly.
Lanyon as well. So
was the Albright Knox, and even the National Gallery to a certain extent.
You see, get the same thing. Look at this crazy painting of the Jester and his king. Again, they talk about, now here's where France does come in. If that's not a Georges Rouault,
no, for sure.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's true.
Pulled out of French. And then, but then the Jester's trying desperately to make that despondent king interested in something, and so brings out all the pretty pink tricks in the background. It clearly doesn't work with the king, but as a painting, it's kind of manically mad. And and he even writes the Jester and his king on the top of the sort of nominate the painting for its meaning. So you can see in all of this that he's looking everywhere, using whatever's necessary for him, and it doesn't matter what country or stylistic tradition it comes from, he'll find a way to make it function inside the composition.
Yeah.
There's that wonderful sense of light and color again, which is again the optimistic sort of notion of they're part of this painting. You know, teasing the king out of his morbidity or whatever he's going through.
And two completely contrasting states of being. So
exactly,
it's wonderful.
That fantastic burst of color, and what I keep seeing is that use of color, that contrast here. So incredible. I'm actually staring at the painting. So
one is in the gallery. Yeah,
at the gallery. Yes. Yeah.
So, Jaleen, I have a question for you that, you know, while the Painters 11 were working in Canada, in the US, the New York abstract expressionists that we talked about, including Robert Motherwell, Adolf Gottlieb was mentioned before, they were making and having huge, making their paintings and having huge impact on the international scene. Tell me a little bit more about the impact of the abstract expressionists on Cahén and the Painters 11. How were they learning about them? Where were they seeing them? And what do you think are the key elements that they're taking from them, as opposed to British art or French art?
Well, I think that you don't get away from abex in this period because they're being very well promoted by the MoMA and the American government and so forth. But I also don't want to overplay them. I think that they've become a touchstone due to so many undergraduate art history textbooks making a big deal about them for so long that we've forgotten that at the time they were just some guys with a whole bunch of other people who were doing very different things. And it was not clear that that was going to be the main line of what we consider, you know, the epitome of American art going later. That said, Oscar Cahén clipped all kinds of art out of Life magazine, including the famous spread of Jackson Pollock, where he's announced as the greatest, hottest thing. And they were shown at the Art Gallery of Toronto in 1949, a handful of them. So we kind of figure he probably went and saw that show. I think that of all the abex people, probably Gottlieb is, for me, I think the biggest touchstone, and particularly Gottlieb's pictographs, because he's looking at symbol languages and he's using that calligraphic kind of mark making, and he's looking at sort of semi and fully recognizable symbols that he's making up himself. Some of them are eyeballs and very obvious. But that is a graphic language that's really, really similar to what was going on in graphic design at the time. They look kind of like logos. And the way he's dividing up his canvases sort of geometrically. Oscar picks up on that quite a bit, I think, that sort of thing. I'm not saying it's a direct, oh, look what Gottlieb's doing, I'm going to try that too. I think all of these graphic languages were in the air, and we can't discount that all artists were looking at all sorts of things and able to distill a message out of it. And in fact, there's an artist who's never been mentioned to my knowledge before in the same breath as Oscar Cahén, but I think is instructive of this in the air kind of thing that can happen. And that is, if you look at the Sudanese artist Ibrahim El Saladi. And he is from Sudan, but he schools at the Slade in London. And if you look, just everyone right now, Google that person, and you would swear the works by Oscar, but they were done
Give us that
5
name
years
again.
after Oscar died. So there's absolutely no crossover, but they share that common.
Jaleen, can you give us that name again?
It's Ibrahim El Saladi. Let's see, I had it written down here. So yeah, I can type
Great
it
thing about Zoom, you can be making notes and,
Salahi,
talk at the same time.
Yeah. So I know we're getting a bit behind here and I need to run
Okay.
off soon.
So Life magazine. So was there more that you wanted to touch on here with?
Well, I just want to
Steinberg and
draw
Stern?
attention to more of the things that are going on in visual culture at large. There's another person who is known more as a designer and illustrator that people might not know either. I will put his name in the chat here as well.
That's great. Thanks.
This is S. Neil Fujita, and I think this person's stuff, and same with David Stone Martin, who is known as an illustrator. Oscar would have been familiar with these two artists in particular because they were doing jazz album covers. And
Yeah.
Oscar was a huge music, jazz specifically fan. He would have owned every one of those records or looked at them in stores and noted the graphics that were very much associated with the jazz scene. And I think that Fujita's work really sort of shows up in the mural that he ends up doing for Imperial Oil, for instance.
Yes. Yeah, we're going to see that in a minute.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jaleen. And I wanted to go back to Robert to ask him to just kind of walk us through his experience of some of these fabulous works, which are in the gallery right now, to just sort of see them as he sees them. Because no one talks about paintings the way Robert Enright does.
Well, that's not true, but I'll tell
pleasure
you. I'll
to
tell you
listen
what
to
one
you.
thing becomes apparent with Jaleen just talking about the notion of the compartmentalization that comes out of the pictographs.
Yes.
A lot of his that kind of compositional strategy is certainly being used in this Untitled piece we're looking at now. So you sort of see that, but you also see that whole black section reminds me terrifically of Franz Klein. So you get that kind of structure of building through line. Then he does something really interesting because by putting in that Kleinian notion, by having the color behind it, he actually creates in what is effectively an abstract painting, he creates a sense of recessional space. So it also begins to play with notions of perception. And then who could not recognize, because it was on the cover of the Guggenheim show of Mark Rothko, the orange and pink section back there. I mean, that's absolute Rothko entirely. So here's, and then there's the blue tracery of the line. So here's a classic example of Oscar Cahén's ability to sort of look around, see what he can use and find ways to make it his own. This is entirely his painting, but its component parts are kind of Frankenstein, and I mean that in a not a pejorative way, but a positive way, from a whole series of other pictorial styles. And he handles it wonderfully. He has a great sense, by the way, of how to use black and actually how to use black in a way that it doesn't become color as much as it becomes thick line. And it's a way that he can compose. And you see that happening throughout his things. And when
this also, to me, again, is the oi and the joy. And again, thanks, Sarah, for that phrase. But, you know, it's really jagged and dark and looks quite menacing on one side of the picture. And then there's this splendid kind of flare of color that pulls you upwards in the upper right. So
he has
Robert,
a piece in 1953.
Could we go back, Robert, just for a second?
Yeah, certainly.
There was a question from an artist in the chat asking and making a statement. Who was using pink in that way at that time?
De Kooning is one of the great painters of pink, and so was Gustin later on. You know, there's a notion that the Ab-Exers were all jerk, stupid men. Two of the greatest of them just adored pink. So if we gender color, we've got two American painters really working inside a palette, which wasn't supposed to be associated with masculinity. So, but it's part of the mythology of the Ab-Ex painters that they were much more complicated than in lots of ways. They have been presented themselves to some extent. I mean, there's lots of macho nonsense going on with those guys.
I mean, the same is true of Painters 11, as I was saying.
Oh, absolutely.
You know,
for sure.
Can I just jump in about the color?
Wild. Yes.
Going back to your graphic arts here, that's magenta, and you've got some cyan going on there too. this
True,
idea
yeah.
of black and then laying in spots of colors directly from the kinds of graphic processes that Oscar was very familiar with, doing color separations and working with the
Mhm.
colors of the
Yeah,
printing press.
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's nice, actually. Of course, that's right. We don't do that anymore because that's not the way printing happens, but it certainly was the way it used to happen with color separations.
Okay, so I'm gonna move us along fairly briskly now, but Robert and anyone, I would love to know your quick thoughts about this.
Well,
extraordinary-
there's that same arm that comes out. That looks like a
Yeah.
prize fighter's arm on the left-hand side, punching its way through the outside.
Mhm.
And the other arm curls behind to contain that blue and red and green area that's going to get around. I mean, this is a magnificently composed painting with terrific energy. It's just beautifully, beautifully made. It has both a sense of compression and a sense of the ability of coming apart. It's just
Yeah.
masterful, masterful work.
With this kind of vortex that everything was swirling around at the core.
Yeah, it's very,
And painted at about the same time as the warrior.
yeah.
I can't tell you, I mean, I'm looking at these paintings as you're discussing them, and it is, it is so extraordinary. Well, first of all, your insights, Robert, but just the colors and the impact of these works, which is fresh and contemporary, even though it is much, earlier.
Yeah. So this is a little nod to Canadian landscape painting, I suppose, in a way.
Well,
But
you know what else is interesting about it, Sarah, is there are two Gottlieb pictographs, one called Masquerade in the High Museum in Atlanta,
yeah,
and one called Augury that's in the Guggenheim collection right now, both done in 1945, that
Yeah.
except for the orientation, they're done vertically rather, that you would swear to God that they were the same painting. I mean, there's no question. And this one, here's an example of how light and how beautiful his touch can be. And this
Yeah.
is the touch of a really fine drawer that goes on in this
yeah,
painting.
yeah. And that's all also very much in evidence in the graphic
Mhm.
Yeah.
career. Yeah. So Sarah, Angela, you were going to talk to us a little bit about, the back and forth between the illustration work and the abstract paintings. And we're just, we're just finding ourselves touching on that now.
And I think that I know that there are audience members who want to see what's in the gallery. So
Mhm.
I want to be brief about this, but I think what we can see here is, if you're looking at this form of the hand, the beak, the claw. Earlier in the discussion, we talked about Graham Sutherland, the British modern artist. Cahén, Harold Town famously said that Oscar Cahén loved Graham Sutherland's work, collected it, etc.
Mhm.
But at the same time, Cahén was so voracious in his appetite for looking at other artists' work and turning it into a
Yes.
film. But I think what's incredible about this slide that we're looking at is that we can see that really at the same time, he's working within the medium of graphic design
Mhm.
and as well in abstract art, and these forms, these motifs reappear. And then there's
Recur,
another
yeah.
slide. Again,
We just wanted to tuck this in because it's not, these are not claws, and yet he takes that shape and its expressive capacity and kind of reiterates it then and recycles it in other ways.
So something that we see about him as an artist is that he does have an iconography of style that he is deploying, whether it is in his abstract works, his graphic design works, and the two blend very well together and very seamlessly. And that was something that I really admired about Jaleen's book, when she was working on it, was that that she said that this relationship was meaningful, powerful, and that it's something that we should pay attention to.
Yes.
and not separate
Not
components.
segregate them out. Yes.
That's right. And then the comment that Jaleen made about looking at album covers, all of these things were playing in and feeding in. And again, here we can see another example of an illustration on the left,
Mhm.
right? That was done for a magazine in 1951. And at the same time, the railroad yard, 1951. So again, these are motifs that continue to play out through all of his art, and in such a beautiful and magnificent way.
That's also a beautiful example, that those images we were just looking at, of how someone who was as fine an illustrator as he was takes that illustration and finds a way to translate it into images that look like totemic pictographs as well. I mean, Pank doesn't do anything different than is happening on Semaphore on the left-hand side there. I mean, you know, there is this notion, and when you mentioned Graham Sutherland, it's true. Graham Sutherland is a surrealist, but he takes Picasso's surrealism and makes it his own. Oscar takes Graham Sutherland's surrealism and finds a way to play with it as well. So the trajectory of art is never so direct that you just see one thing and think that defines everything. It is this constant negotiation and renegotiation of pictorial imagery from one painter to another. So that's what makes it so exciting. That's what the real art history is. Jeff Wall says there is no, all images are contemporary images. There's no such thing as an old-fashioned painting. They are all alive to us today. And I think Cahén is an example. You see that happening all the time. And his influence on others of the painters 11, which is one area that really has to be investigated. There's got to be Canadian art historians out there who really want to interrogate what the legacy he left, because I don't think there's any doubt that he was certainly the most interesting and inventive of all of the painters 11.
Yeah, and I think the question, Robert, is that, you know, and this thing I was touching on earlier about how the painters 11 are not held up and studied and you know, questioned as much as the history of abstract painting in Quebec, which has been studied, you know, black and blue by scholars for decades and decades. Why do you think we don't know more? Why is Oscar Cahén not a bigger household name? Why are the painters 11 in obscurity, relatively speaking?
Well, just a question from the audience to pick up on what Sarah just said. Can you make a quick comment on the importance of painters 11 and their impact on Canadian art? Sort of moves right into Sarah's question or comment or observation.
Well, part of it, you know, when I reviewed the book for the Globe and Mail when it came out in 2017, I mean, I opened with the thing that continues to frighten me, and that's that poem by Earl Burney that he wrote back in the 40s, that in Canada, it's by our lack of ghosts we're haunted.
Yeah.
And there is a tendency among Canadians, is that our modesty or what? Do we suffer from cultural amnesia? We don't. I mean, we didn't realize, now there's reasons for this, by the way. After all, Oscar Cahén's work disappeared for a long period of time for all kinds of reasons, personal reasons connected to the family. And were it not for Michael, his son, sort of coming back and then finding people to work with, which he's done, it's made a difference. But I didn't know, I'm not an art historian, but I didn't know anything about him hardly. So there's so much still to know about that. So we have to haunt ourselves with the ghosts we have and still recognize them. I mean, look at that fabulous painting. I mean, it looks like Gorky sort of, but it isn't. I mean, it's entirely his own, and it made the year of his death. Who knows what he would have done? Although I think Spalding is right in saying that we can't continue to lament the fact that he died young. That's a tragedy, but he left a hell of a legacy behind him.
Oh, yeah.
So we're not dealing with somebody who was, maybe he would have got much better, but what we were left with is already rather extraordinary.
Yeah, and there's some really good bits of retrieval work that are going on. For example, these Imperial Oil Executive Office building, this amazing mural, which is being, this is sort of a blurry picture, but this has been saved and is being, you know, will be worked on at Robert McLaughlin Gallery in Oshawa. If anyone out there wants to help Robert McLaughlin Gallery to do this work, please put your hand up, because it's wonderful, a bloody miracle, given how little this country does tend to recognize its artists' importance, that this thing still exists, and here it is under its protective yellow film. But you know, you know, try and pull these careers up into view, where we can look at them again from these, you know, from these fresh perspectives. And I think, you know, everyone tonight, you know, has helped us really to understand how much more complicated the story of painting in Toronto was in this period, and Cahén's extraordinary impact on it, this catalytic agent who arrives from Europe and just ignites everyone's confidence and imagination and sense of possibility. I think we have gone over 7 o'clock, so I'm wondering if there are some key questions that we want to quickly ask, or if we should sign off, or Pat and Eve, what do you think?
We have answered most of the questions. I was posing some of them as we went along, but we do have a request, given that there is a camera in Pat's gallery, to perhaps scan the main room of the
what
exhibition.
a great idea.
Is that a possibility, to have a look at what we're presenting in Toronto that will open on Saturday?
Absolutely.
I should mention while Pat is.
I'm going to get out of the way here. What you're looking at now is the paintings that are in center space, which is our feature gallery. And
There's Gesture in the King.
Yeah, I'm not sure why TrépanierBaer just came up, but say, did we lose the feed there?
No,
Okay, there
just-
it is.
There
Yeah.
it is.
And then Gesturing King is off to the left. The graphic drawing there beside the warrior is actually a working drawing for the warrior.
Yeah, there were four drawings that are officially recognized as being studies for the painting.
And then here we have the Jester and the King, which is juxtaposed with that other very early work on paper, which is in the, I don't know if Renzo can know, we can't scan around too much more without going to handheld camera.
Well, this is why we all need to go tomorrow night to your opening, Pat.
I was going to say, you've got to come and see these as we were talking about them tonight. Sorry. As we were talking about them tonight, I kept looking at them like the Jester's right there. And the semaphore hung in my office for, 7 or 8 months, and it became my absolute favorite. So you just have to come and see them. And I can't answer the question why Oscar Cahén is not better known. If you walk into this gallery, it is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary.
I can't wait to do so. And I should let the listeners who are in Toronto, or even those of you out there that want to converge on Saturday, David Urban and Gina Rorai are going to be with me in the gallery at Pat's, talking about as painters, their reaction to Cahén's works. And they are a wonderful couple of artists. They are also a partnership in life, and they spend a goodly part of their time arguing and discussing about art and painting in particular. And I've been lucky enough to be a fly on the wall in some of those discussions, and I know it'll be a great afternoon. So
that'll be an extraordinary, and it will be recorded. But I would urge everybody who can come to come on Saturday to hear this. And then we do have an opening between 2 and 4. But this is just a luscious celebration of painting.
Someone is asking, thank you, everyone, but someone's asking, what is the name of the gallery? It's Feheley Fine Arts. It's right there at the bottom of the screen. And it's
Feheley is spelled, it's not like touchy-feely as I call her, but it's Feheley, Feheley, if you're looking it up.
Right. And it's in George Street, downtown Toronto, just a block from the St. Lawrence Market, in an old stable.
And it's a wonderful spot.
Well,
thank you everyone for being with us. And Pat and Eve, thank you for asking me to do this. And Sarah, all the amazing pre-work you did with us on all that fantastic archival material you had in the book. Jaleen, your expertise is amazing, and your research. Robert, thank you. What a great bunch. Thank you all.
Indeed,
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye,
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.